Hi, everybody. Welcome back to GOA Chats. Michael and I are super excited to do this again at the start of the 25-26 school year. And we get to have an amazing guest with us, Julie Kallio, who's the lead researcher at the Breck School in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have been talking to Julie for years now, I think. She
hmm
first served as a member of our PL Advisory Council. Not going to go too far in depth about how we know each other, what she does, because all of that will be found on the website. I want to reserve our 20 minutes for conversation, but I will say that so much of Julie's work has been intriguing and inspiring. And so we're super excited to maybe talk about that, maybe talk about other things, but just basically have a fun conversation with Julie. So, Michael, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm happy to kick us off. So, Julie, we have a favorite question that we like to start with, and it is, what is your superpower? How did you acquire it? How do you use it? What feeds it? We'd love to hear about
Sounds
that.
good. I would say, and maybe this is overly simplistic, but my superpower is curiosity. And when I was thinking about this, so my parents were both teachers. My mom sold Discovery Toys in the 80s, and these were some of the first like educational, like the toys with the purpose of providing play experiences for kids that taught them something. And so I was the demo kid. I would go to toy parties with her, and I would play with all of these board games and manipulatives. And so I think that sense of play. And my dad was a PE teacher, so a lot of games. And I was always asking questions like, well, how do you play it? And why is the game work this way? Another funny thing is in high school physics, I got the award, which I don't know if it was sort of like the side award for asks the most questions in class, which always, I wanted to understand. I was like, you're showing me things, like I want to know how this works. And I think over the course of then becoming a teacher and eventually getting my PhD, it was always this like, I wanted to understand how the system worked. Like, why was I having this experience? And so, how did I think I had that curiosity from what I learned at home. But then through the course of my own education, I learned how to ask questions and how to try to think about the world around me in a way that could actually like do good work in the world. So I think that's my superpower.
I love that. I'm reflecting on how I was thinking on like, well, what comes first, the curiosity or the expression of that curiosity? Because is it play or asking questions or like what's happening first? Is it problem solving? Because I think so much of the conversation right now is often like how do we ensure that students have the opportunity to be curious and ask
Mm-hmm.
questions and things? And then it often comes to this like, do you design the thing that's going to make them curious or do they have to be curious before they get to the experience. I'm wondering if you have any insight
Yeah,
on.
I mean, I think it's those virtuous cycles, right? Like the kid, like I actually think most kids are curious. And so, how do we not stamp it out of them as they go through school and actually continue to encourage it? And how do we pair that? I was just having a conversation with a colleague about like the sort of content versus skills, like, inquiry as this sort of like free for all, and kids aren't learning content versus a sort of dogmatic curriculum where everybody has to learn the same thing. And it's like, well, you got to go somewhere in the middle. You have to give kids things to think about, and they have to have a chance to ask questions. So it is that dance between the two. And then as kids learn to ask questions, they ask more questions. I mean, I think I had parents who entertained a lot of questions and asked me them back, like, well, what do you think? I feel like when my kids ask me questions, that's the first thing I say. What do you think? Rather than trying to answer it for them. So, yeah, it is both.
It is always both,
Right.
right? And I agree, right? We've got to create those conditions that force students to ask questions, and we need to encourage it. But I agree. I mean, I also think that the curiosity skill of curiosity is probably one of the most important for schools to teach. Um, and to create conditions for, like you're saying.
Mhm.
But also sometimes there's an answer.
And then having methods. I mean, so I was a biology teacher. I like the way that I learned to ask questions was through the scientific method. Like it is fundamentally based on having questions about the world. And then how do you have evidence and what does that help you understand about the world? And then when I shifted to more social science, it was okay. And people are messy. So you can't study them in the same way you would study like bacteria in a petri dish. So, how do you study people and how do you ask questions about how they're interacting? And then, okay, so there's a theory about how it works. How does that play out in this situation? So, it's that entering with curiosity, but also learning how to think about it and communicate around those ideas so that you not that you get answers, but you make more sense of it, I guess.
Mhm. And so we've been talking a lot so far in 2 minutes
Mm-hmm.
about the student angle of this, but so a lot of the work that you do is also with the grown-ups in the building or
Mm-hmm.
the adults in the building, and what you're talking about with processes and methods and visually representing things for adults.
Mm-hmm.
How has your natural curiosity helped kind of create the conditions for the adults around you to be curious too?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I learned early on in graduate school, largely from the improvement science work that came out of the Carnegie Foundation, was and this aligns with the design thinking from the D school of rather than being really like imaginative about okay, there's all these possibilities, we could make this, and innovation as like invention. It was also like how do we get curious about the problem and rather than making assumptions about the current state and like just thinking about the future, like actually let's look at the problem that is. How do we get curious? How do we understand the root causes of it? And that being able to describe the current state of the system or the current problem actually becomes the opening for making change. And so I think that's where learning that perspective of how do you do that with adults, that there is a curiosity to just understanding how the problems work. And you can get stuck there, right? A lot of critical research, I think, gets stuck in sort of navel gazing around here are all these problems.
Mhm.
And that's where I like the improvement science or the design work that says, okay, now that we understand the problem, how are we going to shift people to take action in lots of different ways?
So I'm so curious as like the institutional research, the lead researcher at a school,
Mm-hmm.
how do you identify or like what qualifies as a problem? And how do you name that and then bring I mean, there's a million follow-up questions, but
Yeah.
how do you surface those?
Yeah. So I think of a problem as being like, it's a perception, right? There's a perception that there's a gap between the way things are and the way you want them to be, just sort of very basically. And people have different perceptions across the system of what is a problem. I use the example of like kids walking down in the hallway. Some people see it as a problem, like they're not quiet, and some people are like, "This is great. Kids are walking down the hall and they're chatting, and this is what school should look like." So it's a perception of a problem. And then a lot of my work is listening and saying, okay, so it feels like an issue that we're running into is around like math acceleration in the lower school. That's something where there's either conflict or there's people seem like they want different things. And so, how do we then bring people together to say, how do we understand the current situation? And sometimes just understanding it, we realize like, oh, we just have different perspectives, but we're actually doing the thing we want to do. And sometimes we realize we're not doing the thing we want to do and we want to make change. So I would say that's like my role as researcher is understanding, like finding those challenges and saying, okay, if this is something we want to work on, then I can build the process for how we work on it. Um, but we every time we work on a problem, I start with who are the people who need to be in here and why are we doing this? And like let's diagnose kind of where we're at so that we know why we're doing the work. And we bound it. So worked on a project where we talked about hiring and retention was sort of the initial framing for me, that was a challenge. And I said, okay, but are we working on hiring or retention? Which one are we working on? Because those are different things that we're going to talk about in the system. And we had probably half an hour of like, which one should we focus on now? That's not my decision to make. That's for the folks who are in charge of it, really, who have the authority in the system. But it's my responsibility to set up the conditions to have those conversations.
I love that. I mean, I'm also hearing that there's a lot of listening and observing. And so, right, because before you're even identifying that like hiring and retention is maybe a problem, but there's a gap exists there somewhere and you need to name it and hone in on it. How are you even surfacing that? Like, what's the even pre-step? Are you looking at data? Are you just, is it talking and just conversations and kind of picking up on things?
And I think that's where some of the intuition or sort of social part of this comes in, because it's there's no right or wrong problem to start with. There's the like, what is the thing that like people are interested in right now? What is the thing that's strategic? What is the thing that's the highest leverage? And what do I have people willing to work on? I mean, there are problems that like maybe we should address like right away, but like it's the wrong time of year. We don't have the right people in sort of the right positions. And then like, okay, we're not ready for that. And then actually one of the things I'm most excited about for this school year is we've been building a lot of systems here at Breck, that this year we get to launch some of these projects that I feel like I've been laying the groundwork for 3 years. And now I'm like, okay, we're here, we can do the work. But I didn't know. I mean, 3 years ago, I wasn't like, okay, a 3-year plan, this is when we're going to do it. It's kind of like, okay, when is the synergy in the system going to be ready to work on that problem? So, and I check a lot of it. So I think one of the things I learned in my PhD program around like designing with people, co-design, is like you member check. You go and say like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Is that what you're thinking? is you know is this something that you're interested to do? And I don't have positional authority in my role, but I have a lot of influence, and so I can go to people and say, hey, do you want to work on this? And a lot of times they're like, yes, I would love to. And I'm like, great, let's. And then I'll say like, okay, I'm going to try and get a group together, let's see what's going to happen. And then sometimes I have to say like, I don't think it's the right time, let's push it off. So it's a lot of that like social negotiation of figuring out when's the right time. And I think this is also like a design mindset, that there's no one and only time, or there's not like it's sort of like, are the conditions right? Not, and I'm not going to push it if it's not right. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So.
One other thing about your process that is intriguing to me is that, so for an example, like hiring and retention, which is a huge topic, it's been studied, it's all over the place. What I'm hearing is, instead of first going to, I mean, you can correct me on this too, but I think so often when presented with a problem, the idea is, oh, I understand the perception of this problem. So I will go out and do all this research and see what other people have said or done about it, and then come back with these findings. But in your process, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you are being more kind of inclusive at the start, not just of perspectives and ideas, but even in framing the problem, staying within the system itself, uh,
Yeah.
and rather than going straight to out. I don't know if I articulated that well, but you're
Yeah. So I
in
think
the system.
it's a little bit of both. And so I think when I think about how do I start, it is usually I like talk to people, and I also have ideas from outside that I've either read about or talked to people outside of the school about, that I'm like, how can I think about it here? And so I can show an example from some of the curriculum work that I did, where I really started with what we were currently working on here. And let me just pull this up. Okay, so you can see on here. So we started with this idea of what does our P12 science sequence look like? Breck is a P12 independent school. We have about 1,200 students. We have a lot of pathways for kids to figure out how they want to navigate science, the science curriculum. And so rather than going to like, well, what should a science department look like? I was like, okay, I want to talk to our science department chair and say, like, well, what does it look like? What is the current state of it? And so I did about an hour interview with him, and you can see I just like wrote down, tried to describe in pictures and visuals what it. Now, I was a science teacher, so I have beliefs about what the science progression should be. I have a background of understanding the next generation science standards. I have some opinions about inquiry, so you can see like the 2x2 matrix around like inquiry of open-ended versus closed-ended, student-led versus teacher-led. Like those are things that I am bringing into the representation that I'm making. And I'm also listening and trying to incorporate what he's saying into the drawing. And then I took that and then did an updated version where, and these are for a couple different departments, where I then brought them these sort of like ideas of how we could represent the structure of their department. Then they gave me feedback and said, okay, actually it's like this. And I said, well, what if we brought in some of the standards and said, hey, these are these ideas from outside of Breck that could inform what our departments look like. And so then we kind of did this back and forth, and we eventually got from something that was sort of the base level that we had talked about to, okay, making it into a visual that helps communicate the structure. This is now for history and social studies, the structure of the department and the major ideas from standards that are incorporated. So I think that's an example of like, here's a process that uses these representations that is both the ideas from inside the school and the ideas from outside of the school that bring those together in. Now we're at the point where we can say, like, is this the social studies department that we want? I don't have a strong, I do on science, but on this one, I don't have the strong opinions about this because this isn't my discipline or department. But now we can make good decisions that say, like, is this the right pathway for kids and our kids right now in Minneapolis today? But that's like, and I think that is one of the ways that my work is different from institutional research. Institutional research is often starting with data about the current conditions of the system. And so I incorporate some of that. It's also some of the how do we learn from research outside the school and translate that into practice.
This is so cool. It is so cool. And it's just imagining
Yeah.
the various ways that same process can be replicated. So you talked about hiring, about curriculum. These are like big things that sometimes take years. And you were talking about bounding. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about how you've bounded both sort of like
Yeah.
the solution, but I'm assuming time, how many people get involved? How do you set
Yeah.
kind of guardrails around
Yeah,
this?
so I can talk about bounding in terms of like the problem and then also the how do you get this work done in schools? So we've come up with a process we call it our 4 meeting design sprint. And so it's literally 4 meetings. And I try to be really mindful that like it's hard to get administrators together. And so when they're together, I'm going to use their time. And then we always have homework in between. So we have 4 meetings. The first meeting is articulating the problem. And oftentimes it's how should we think about the problem? What is our schema for understanding it? And so in the example of hiring, I said, okay, we can think about hiring as a funnel and we can think about it as a pipeline. Which one of those is like, they are metaphors that are going to make a difference in terms of how we talk about this? Does the funnel, and so we have a conversation about this. We ended up going with a funnel with the idea of there are points at which the pool of people gets smaller. People do talk about it as a pipeline where it's like leaky. And so we decided to go with a funnel. And then that becomes our metaphor throughout. So we have the first meeting where we really talk about the problem, bounding it. The second, usually between the first and the second, there's some sort of homework to go talk to people. I think we want teacher voice in all of these processes, or student voice or parent voice, but it's impractical to try to get all those people together and in the room. So we do that by, okay, you're going to go talk to 3 hiring managers and get their feedback. Actually, in this one, I said, go talk to 3 people who were hired this year and what was their experience of the process. And so then the second meeting, we talk about what did we learn about our own system by listening to these people, what trends, what themes. And as I'm doing it, I usually am working on a whiteboard. I don't like slides as much anymore. So I have a big whiteboard and I'm like, here's the funnel. Okay, here's the thing you just said. Here, does it fit here? Is this the part in the funnel that you feel like that experience came from? And so we try to overlay our understanding of the system on how we're thinking about it. And again, we're constructing this common understanding of our system. By the third one, that's when we start to say, okay, what sort of data do we have on this? What sort of shifts do we think, like, where do we want to go with this? That's the part. So like the third meeting is when we start to talk about what action or what solutions might be out there, because now we're well grounded in what our current system is. And then really by the fourth, it's, okay, here are the action items. And here's your, like, okay, go off and do your work. And that gets us enough to kind of launch something. And then it distributes the work of actually doing the change out into the people who are responsible for it. And then that's sort of where my role ends. There sometimes is like follow-up and accountability within, either the division or the department or the school. So that's our 4 design sprint process. And that's kind of how I bound it in terms of like meeting time, my commitment of time, the bounding. And I draw a lot on Adrienne Marie Brown. And when she talks about the role of the facilitator, as a facilitator, it is not for me to decide what we should work on. And in fact, I like that my role in the organization is just a little bit outside the hierarchy, because I am not a hiring manager. I don't do this. And so I don't have the same, I am committed to the organization, don't get me wrong, but I don't have the same skin in the game in terms of like, this is my work that it affects. And so my role is to get people to say, like, this is why they want to work on it and how they want to work on it. That also generates the buy-in. I mean, that's all participatory design language as well. And I kind of push back. So in this hiring example, we decided, okay, we're only working on hiring. And I said, well, what are we hiring for? Like, what is the goal? And it came like hiring for greater diversity. And I said, okay, like, let's unpack that. What diversity are we talking about? What does that look like? And we ended up deciding racial diversity, geographic diversity, and pedagogical expertise. And I was like, great. Those are things that we can now talk about, and not that we have to measure everything, but we can measure that so that we know whether or not our work did anything, whether there was any sort of change. And that kind of comes from the improvement science work. So once we have that, now we're bounded. So now we're going to look at these 3 things very specifically. And even like the idea of pedagogical expertise. What does that mean? And that actually was more for our upper school than it was for a lower school. It's very rare to hire a lower school teacher who doesn't have a teaching degree, because you are running a classroom with young children in a way that's different. And in independent schools, it is typical that our upper school teachers have content and disciplinary expertise and less pedagogical expertise. So that is a particular challenge for the upper school. So how do we have a P12 conversation,
right,
but break it down in those ways? And that is a way of bounding. And in some ways, that's also kind of the funnel of problem solving. We start or problem identification. We start from this like really vague amorphous thing. And that's my role of like curiosity, right? Like, well, what do you mean? Well, tell me what you mean by that word. Well, what is the definition of it? How do you want to define hiring? Because there's actually recruitment and hiring. Are those the same? Is it a hiring funnel that includes recruitment, or is it recruitment and then hiring? sometimes it feels pedantic, and we have to be clear on the things we are talking about. I think that is actually, and I will credit my advisor in my PhD advisor, because he was looking at my writing and he was like, Julie, you use pronouns all the time. You use they or we or it. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I have to be a lot clearer. And so instead of saying they, then the teachers who participated in the study, like it's about being specific so that you're communicating clearly.
This is amazing. Michael, I'm interrupting you. But I'm interrupting in the worst way because speaking of bounding, I have to time bound this conversation, which is impossible to do because I have a million follow-up questions, as I have for the years that I've gotten to talk to you, Julie. It's tremendously valuable to have your skill set, and the way that you share it makes it feel accessible and inspiring to me, and I'm sure it will to the people who watch or listen to this conversation. Like, there is so much here that is affirming and makes big problems feel like ones that people can approach or tackle. And I think that's just a huge gift in the world of education. I love that you're willing to share your processes and your ways of thinking through it. So for those who have listened and watched, Julie's going to be supporting some GOA professional learning course stuff. I think I'm hopeful that we get to have more ways to share your work, but if you're interested in connecting with her, we'll share information on how to do that as well. Um, Thank you as always for your time. Michael,
Yes, thank
back
you.
to you. I interrupted you.
Nope. Thank you so much, Julie. You were clearly the kid who asked why all the time, right? Due to the games, that superpower was showing up when you were little, I'm sure. Thank you for
Well,
your time and being with us.
I tell my kids that those kids who ask a lot of questions, it'll serve them well later in life, even if right now you would like compliance. Like,
That's right.
encourage those questions now, right?
Yes.
And I love that
Thank
the
you.
work you're doing is to find the answers. It's a beautiful circle. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.